Hi, this is Ruth McCain. Sorry for the confusion as we started. And I want to thank you all for coming this afternoon to what I think is going to be a very exciting session with the leadership of BoardSource and with a special guest, Ramona Johnson. My name is Ruth McCain. I'm the editor-in-chief of the nonprofit Quarterly. And this afternoon, we are doing a webinar entitled The Declining Diversity of Nonprofit Boards and What to Do About It. It is an exclusive deep dive into that aspect of BoardSource's latest report, Leading with Intent. Today, we are discussing the most vivid of the findings, which is that there appears to be a declining diversity on nonprofit boards. But the survey, thankfully, did not just identify the problem, but it helps to pinpoint where the problem may lie and what to do about it. Who we have with us today is Ann Wallestead, BoardSource's CEO. Say hi, Ann.
Hi there.
Renetta Walker, BoardSource's Chief Governance Officer and Vice President of Programs. A really long title, so you have to be important. And special guest Ramona Johnson, Senior Relationship Manager for the Southern Region with NeighborWorks America. Today's webinar is brought to you by Board Effect, and we're very grateful for this sponsor. Board Effect provides web-based tools to drive efficiency, effectiveness, and engagement among your board of directors, executives, and administrators. More than 1,400 leading organizations and over 100,000 users rely on Board Effect to manage board-related information online and advance the work of their boards. Board Effect allows truly easy management of board information while also enabling board directors to fulfill their responsibilities of elevating organizational performance. And I do want to say something else about our sponsor before we move on. Our sponsors are incredibly important to us and to you in that they allow us to offer these kinds of sessions for free. And so we really do suggest that you check them out when you get a chance. This webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be shared with all the attendees shortly after the meeting. So don't keep asking us whether we're going to do that, because it's always. We will also make the webinar freely available on our website along with PowerPoint slides to be accessed at any time. We're going to leave some time for questions at the end, so if you think of one, please post it in the chat box to the right of your on the right of your screen, and we'll respond after the formal presentation. You can really post them at any time. I'm going to keep an eye on them. And the ones that look like they're most apropos or needed in the conversation are the ones that I'll call out. Finally, we are on social media today, and you can follow today's conversation with our hashtag #DiversifyYourBoard. Feel free to post questions or comments during or after our presentation. And now I'm going to hand this over to Ann Wallestead, who's going to walk us through the findings. I do want to say before I hand it over to Ann, this is only one aspect of the incredibly rich findings in Leading with Intent. And so our intention is to bring you some of the other findings in subsequent webinars, but this is definitely the most significant, I think, as we can see it right now. So with that said, Ann, perhaps you can present the findings to us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ruth, and thanks to Nonprofit Quarterly for your willingness to host this conversation. And as Ruth shared, we really want to share the findings from the study, and then we're going to have an opportunity for Renetta Walker, also from BoardSource, and Ramona Johnson from NeighborWorks to share some commentary about what they're seeing really on the ground in terms of what boards are grappling with and why we face these challenges in terms of diversity. And then we'll open it up for questions. So there really are three parts of the conversation, starting with really the data and what the data tell us about what's actually happening in nonprofit boards vis-a-vis diversity. So that's where we're going to start. So just first, we want to tell you a little bit about the study itself in terms of what it covers, what it's all about, and why we do it. So Leading with Intent is BoardSource's biennial study of board composition, culture, and performance. So we ask a whole battery of questions of both chief executives or executive directors and board chairs, and are able to analyze their responses in a way that's quite illuminating. We first started doing some version of this survey in 1994, and they provide moment-in-time snapshots in an every 2 to 3 year increments, that while they are not a true longitudinal study because they don't have a stable sample, it's really interesting to look at how those snapshots have changed over the past 20 plus years. As I mentioned, it's a convenient sample of executives and board chairs, so this is not something where we can say this is a randomized sample or necessarily representative, but it is illuminating nonetheless, and you'll see in the future slides that we really do have a pretty good cross-section of the sector represented from these findings. And I'll say just right off the bat, the full report is available at leadingwithintent.org. So as you hear some of these findings and get curious about what else the report says, we encourage you both to join us for future webinars, but also to really download and read the entire report, which is available for free. So just a little bit more about the respondents to the survey. So we had close to 1,800 individual nonprofit leaders respond to the survey, and that represents close to 1,400 chief executives or executive directors, and then close to 400 board chairs. We have a small subset of about 150 organizations for which we have actually responses from both the chief executives and the board chairs. So a future report will be looking at those paired responses and what we can learn specifically from those organizations. So watch for that. Just looking at the next slide then to give you a sense of the types of organizations that are represented within this sample. As I mentioned, it's a pretty good cross-section of the nonprofit sector. We have good representation from organizations of a wide range of sizes, geographic scope, and type of organization, which is obviously important as you think about these findings and the types of organizations that the findings really represent and draw from. So I mentioned that the study looks at composition, culture, practices, and performance. We really structure the report into 4 main sections. So first we look at the people, who serves on boards, what are the demographics, which is obviously something we're going to talk about more today. How is the board structured and organized? Then we look at the culture of the board and how folks are interacting with each other and what boards are saying about the way that they work together, the work that they actually do. So what board practices are being adopted? Where are boards doing really well in terms of their performance? Where do they themselves see challenges? And then for the first time, this year's study really looks at what does the board, through board chairs and through executive directors, say about the impact of their board on organizational performance. So that's something that we haven't looked at as closely before, and there are some really interesting and rich insights there that we'll talk about in a subsequent webinar. So some of the key findings. First, and we're going to spend the rest of the webinar talking about this first bullet, board diversity. Boards are unfortunately no more diverse than they were 2 years ago, and current recruitment priorities indicate that this is unlikely to change. And as you'll see in our discussion, it's not just that they haven't changed from 2 years ago, they really haven't changed in more than 2 decades since we first started gathering data in 1994. Really incremental progress, but nothing that I think we can point to and be proud of as a sector, and we're going to talk about why that is. Some good news that came from the study, boards are starting to embrace their roles as advocates for their missions. So board engagement and advocacy, we really saw improvement there in the past 2 years. Again, not the same sample, but really significant change going from 33% of boards reporting board engagement and advocacy to now 52%. So we were really pleased to see that engagement increasing. Also on board engagement, strong understanding is found to be linked to stronger engagement strategy and external leadership, which was an interesting finding and we thought significant. Boards that assess themselves across the board do better on all areas of board performance. And interestingly, recency matters. So it's not just assessing your board, but doing it with some level of frequency that really does seem to have a positive relationship with stronger board performance overall. And then finally, as I mentioned, looking at board impact, what really matters in terms of the board's impact on organizational performance. These are all about perceptions, but both board chairs and executive directors said that two of the most important things were the board's understanding of its roles and responsibilities and the board's ability to work as a collaborative team toward shared goals. So those were really interesting findings, we thought, in terms of what matters most or what might matter most in terms of the board's impact on organizational performance. And again, we're going to go into some of these in future webinars because today's focus is really about the diversity of boards and the demographic makeup of nonprofit boards today. So on the slide, you see the overview of board demographics as of this survey. So 90% of chief executives, 90% of board chairs, 84% of board members overall are Caucasian, and then you can see the percentages of other demographics, also gender diversity and age diversity. So I'm going to skip ahead to the next slide because what's important to know is that when we ask executive directors or CEOs and board members, board chairs, how do you think you're doing in terms of diversity? We asked about all different forms of diversity, or these particular 6 forms of diversity. And as you can see on the slide, the level of dissatisfaction with, in particular, the racial and ethnic diversity of boards is quite significant. 65% of executives are reporting that they are dissatisfied with the level of racial and ethnic diversity on their boards. And if we can advance to the next slide, we'll see that board chairs, while slightly less dissatisfied, it was still the area of diversity where there was the lowest level of satisfaction. So 41% of board chairs reporting that they were dissatisfied with the level of racial and ethnic diversity. So I say that and share that because while we do believe that all forms of diversity are important, and particularly based on the mission areas of an organization, understanding the types of diversity that are most important for an organization's work is really critical. But clearly, there's a level of dissatisfaction with racial and ethnic diversity that warranted further explanation and further study. So that's really where we're going to spend the bulk of our time today, is focused on the racial and ethnic diversity of boards. So looking at the next slide, you can see just that comparison between executives and board chairs and their level of dissatisfaction. So in the previous slides, somewhat dissatisfied and extremely dissatisfied were grouped together. Here they're broken out, so you can see just that level of dissatisfaction and also the variance between executives and board chairs, which is important, and we're going to talk about this a little bit when Vernetta and Ramona are sharing in terms of understanding why we perhaps have not made more progress. This variance, I think, comes into play there. But nonetheless, both chief executives and board chairs report the highest level of dissatisfaction with racial and ethnic diversity, and it's important to note that 27% of boards report that they are 100% white, and that is actually up. And not in a good way, but up from 25% in 2015. So a full 27% of boards report that they have not one person of color on their board, which we think is pretty significant. So one of the next questions that we wanted to ask organizations is, how important is it to have a diverse board? Does that matter to your organization? We think it matters, and we have a pretty strong opinion about that, but what do organizations themselves think? And you can see here that actually organizations and their leaders think that diversity is quite important. It's important to understanding their work. It's important to building their networks and having diverse networks. It's important to understanding the client population served by the board. So organizations, leaders themselves are saying it's really important that we have a diverse board. So when you look at those things together, we don't have diverse boards, and we think it's really important, you would think that there would be a lot of energy and momentum behind changing the demographics of boards. Unfortunately, that is not the case. So moving to the next slide, we looked at and asked organizations to what extent are demographics a priority in your board recruitment. And we didn't quite ask it that way, and that we didn't only ask about demographics. Instead, we asked what is most important to you in terms of criteria when you're thinking about board recruitment. And you can see demographics do not rate particularly high here. So the first most important, passion for the mission, of course, we would expect and hope that that would be first. But then going down the line, and it's important to note that this was not a forced ranking, and there were not a limited number of choices. So somebody could say that all of these things were very important or of high importance. So when you see this low of numbers in terms of board chairs and executive directors reporting level of importance on demographics, that's really troubling. It's really troubling to see that 24 and 25% are saying that demographics are a high priority. Lots in that medium priority, but a significant percentage that are in the low as well. And when we move to the next slide, you'll see exactly why that's so troubling. This is a little bit dense, so apologies. I'll give you a chance to spend some time with it. But this table is looking at the interface between organizational leaders that said that they were dissatisfied with the level of racial and ethnic diversity on their board, and what level of priority they are placing on demographics in board recruitment. And so what you can see here is that nearly 20% of all chief executives in their responses said both that they were very dissatisfied, so either extremely or somewhat dissatisfied with their board's racial and ethnic diversity, and that they were placing low or no priority on demographics and recruitment. So from BoardSource's perspective, this is really the diagnosis. The fact that we can have this dissonance between attitudes and actions is really, from our perspective, the reason that we haven't made more progress. And it makes us very curious about why is this, but also what can we do about it and what can we really change. So that's where we're going to spend most of the rest of the webinar, having some conversation about where positive change can happen and what it takes to make that happen. So just very quickly, before we move into conversation mode with Renetta and Ramona providing some reflections, I want to share a little bit more about what the data say matter in terms of what it will take to change. So interestingly, we asked a whole set of questions about diversity practices and things that boards are doing or not doing to try and move a diversity, inclusion, and equity agenda within their organizations. And the thing that seemed to be most highly correlated with boards that were actually prioritizing demographics in recruitment was whether or not they had a board level conversation and agreed that it is important to include diversity and inclusion in the organization's core values. So really having a full group conversation about why diversity, inclusion, and to the extent that they're talking about equity are important to the organization's mission, and why it matters to them to be an organization that embraces diversity, inclusion, and equity as a part of their core values. So that was illuminating just in terms of what matters most. Obviously, that then needs to translate into a new recruitment philosophy. So really thinking about understanding why demographics matter to the organization, why diversity and inclusion matter, and then reflecting that in terms of what's being prioritized in board recruitment. And that means a different way of recruiting. What we find in Leading with Intent is that organizations are still relying very, very heavily on the existing networks of current board members. And so if you're at a deficit in terms of diversity and inclusion and you're building on your own networks, that's not necessarily positioning you well to make change. And then finally, moving to action and accountability. And we think to some extent leading with intent helps with that accountability, but we know that's just the start. So let me pause there and invite Ruth and Vernetta and Ramona into the conversation.
Well, all I want to do is to pass it along to Vernetta. We have been actually, BoardSource and NPQ have been in this conversation now for a few years. And personally, it was exciting for me to see the confluence of findings that you have from this report. It seems like a major step forward. And so who I'm going to hand it over to now is Vernetta, who's been very much a part of that conversation of what exactly is the problem here? What are we not seeing? What is the action point? What's the platform? And to hand it over to her to talk also with Ramona. Well, both Ramona and Vernetta have extensive experience in working directly with boards. And so I think they're going to be able to come from a very grounded place, but also a place that says that is, you know, it's time to move. We have to move. And it's not good enough to kind of wring your hands and say this isn't the way we want it to be. But in fact, there is a platform for movement, and we're going to look and experiment with what that is. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Vernetta, to talk with Ramona about this.
Thank you, Ruth. As you know, I think I've shared your same frustration over the years, and we've had a lot of conversations about diversity, inclusion, and equity. And one of the reasons I wanted Ramona to be a part of this conversation is because I'm familiar with the organization she works with, NeighborWorks America. I've been working with them for 11 years, and I was very excited when a little over a year ago, they introduced their new initiative around diversity and inclusion. And I'm not sure, does it include equity?
Yes, it does. Yes.
Okay, so I was really excited because as I think about organizations that struggle with diversity, inclusion, and equity, there are some organizations that are very well positioned to understand the issues. And I think about our grassroots or community-based organizations. So NeighborWorks America, while your affiliates provide a number of different services, I think about affordable housing, lending, and a lot of the training that goes on at the community level, and also how our communities have changed vastly across the country. You're right there, quite often on the front lines. So I wanted to hear what you're learning, because the obstacles that some organizations identify, I would think, if anything, NeighborWorks, you're in a good position to say, well, this shouldn't be an obstacle for us. We have access to people. We're working with, and this isn't all of your affiliates. I know it varies because you're all across the country, but a number of your affiliates are working with people of color, communities of color. And yet, I know when I go to the National Training Institute, the same issues come up, that it's a challenge in our recruiting. So can you share a little bit of what you've learned, whether it's from this last initiative or from working with your own affiliates?
Sure. So NeighborWorks does have a little over 240 network organizations all across the country. And clearly, some organizations, I believe, have really succeeded at being very diverse in terms of the members on their boards. And what I found based on my experience is that it's in large part due to a commitment by the organization, a commitment by the executive director, and a commitment by the board to ensure that they have a diverse representation. So when you start there, it clearly makes diversity a lot easier. And two, which was, I think, pointed out in the study, it has to be placed as a priority, again, by all parties involved. And when you make that commitment, you can, in fact, have very positive outcomes, which we have seen.
So let's set apart a little bit, because you talked about the commitment, and I know one of the things that I have experienced working with some organizations is that I'll see a chief executive or executive director who's very committed. They get it because they're living and breathing the issues day in and day out. And so when they approach the board or the board chair and start having these conversations, there may be some resistance. And that resistance can be very subtle, because everyone wants to say, just like our survey showed, we believe diversity is important. We believe a diverse composition on the board is important. But moving to action, if the board isn't really behind that chief executive, it can take a long time to get some traction. So how have you experienced that? For example, if there's an executive director who's committed, but the board isn't fully behind him or her?
Right. So that does create a challenge for sure. And so the word I would use there is probably more contentment or content. And so if a board chair and the board itself, the body, is content with their recruitment practices, if they are content with their current board structure, if they are content with not necessarily having a diverse board, it does in fact create multiple challenges, and we have seen that. And so you're right, an executive director certainly could bring forth their thoughts, their ideas around why diversity is important, but if it is not embraced by the board itself, then there's very likelihood for change, and we clearly have seen that. And you mentioned earlier in the report that oftentimes recruitment is done based on relationships. So if those relationships are continued to be sort of tapped into, right, those existing relationships, and we've seen that happen as well, friends of a friend of a friend, or sometimes even a family member, then that cycle of, again, the same will continue on with that board.
Okay, so I have a couple of things that I want to add to this conversation, and all of you may want to jump in. We've talked about contentment. We've talked about, the role of the leader, but one thing that has become very clear is that at this moment in time, things are very different. Wherever we look, the unrest, having a number of issues pushed forward in terms of race or racism. And this is one of the reasons I come back to Neighborhoods of America, because you're at that community level. So we definitely need to change the conversation and also move the conversation from words to action. That's going to take something different. And what is it? And Ramona, I want to let you jump in first, and I'll bet Ann and Ruth want to jump in as well. What I want you to jump in or help us understand is, as you hear these conversations and you think about the values of NeighborWorks, how do you help your affiliates make that connection to understand that they really need to demonstrate and live the values? So I know you're going to have to share the values with us, with our audience first, but what are you going to do differently to help the affiliates really understand?
I would say it starts with having those difficult conversations. Again, as we talk about diversity and inclusion, we talk about race, those are not always the easiest conversations to have. But you brought up some really good points about the unrest in Baltimore, and certainly we have other places, many, unfortunately, examples that have existed all across this country. One thing that we are trying to do, however, to get more people engaged in what could be some very difficult conversations, is a lot of sort of peer-to-peer exchange. because as I mentioned before, we do have over 240 organizations. Some, like I said, have full diversity, others do not at all. But if we can begin to have board chairs talk with one another, especially those who may get it with those who may need some help and some guidance and some assistance in education. Again, that may help to begin to have folks thinking a little bit differently. We know that this is a long-standing problem that has existed in this country for a very long time, and it manifests itself, right, clearly in the boardroom as it does other places. So oftentimes changes doesn't occur overnight, but it does begin to take place once we start having these difficult conversations.
Yeah, I think the conversations are very critical, and I'm excited to see some conversations going to a deeper level, or I don't know if it's the next level or a deeper level, but it's going to take more, because there's still some organizations, some boards that are having conversations around, shouldn't we just be colorblind, and thinking that that's going to move the needle, like that's equal. You know, that's all equity. If we view everyone and everything the same, we certainly want qualified board members. But guess what? Qualified board members come in every color. And the fact that the needle hasn't moved in 20 years means that it's time to get very intentional about our recruitment. And that can be a contentious point for some boards. And that willingness, even beyond looking at race and ethnicity, the willingness to be reflective on their own practices. I know, Anne, you had mentioned the people, the culture, the work, and impact, but that culture piece is so important. It's the board welcoming. What are their biases? What's really been preventing them? And to have those deeper conversations, that's going to take some work. And you mentioned, Ramona, we're not going to change this overnight, but I know, Ruth, you and I had a conversation, I think 2 years ago, and we said, you know what, it's not really rocket science. If we all work at this together, we can make the change. So I'll let someone else jump in for a moment. Don't worry, I'll jump back in, but I want to stop taking up all the space.
Well, you know, I mean, I feel like it has been so long that we've been talking about this. And I also recall a conversation that I think we had as well, you, me, and Anne, talking about what we actually have to unlearn in terms of board recruitment, that there's a lot that's been told to us about what the shoulds of board recruitment that in some ways has you know, driven us in some very wrong directions in terms of priorities. And so we have people, you know, we've had a couple of questions in the queue here about, well, what do you do if your priority is to get well-connected people onto your board and you're in an area where the people who are connected to money are all white? I mean, basically that's what the question is, to money and power. And so the question is, you know, how does that strengthen your board? How does it skew it? How does it make it less representative of some interests and more representative of others? And what do we feel about that? I mean, beyond the fact that, in fact, there is a little bit of research that says that for most organizations, getting people with connections does not mean any healthier of a fundraising scenario. I mean, there is research on that and findings that say those two things for a lot of organizations are not connected. We still keep going after that as if it's some kind of a manna from heaven, some kind of a God's word to us about how we should handle our boards. And I think there's a couple of issues there. One is just seeing the connection piece as sacrosanct, and the other one is seeing the skills matrix piece as sacrosanct. I mean, I think
fundamentally,
there is some research out there that does say, and it's, you know, this is reflected even in your findings, that having a common passion for the mission is incredibly important, and probably centrally important in a board. But if you do that without having the full representation of the community, you're automatically marginalizing your organization, and you're marginalizing the community at the same time. And so where does that get you? I feel like it is a moment. I thought that the finding around the seemingly where a lot of the resistance was coming from, which is the boardroom, and you know, kind of what they were stuck on, this kind of between oh, woe is us, we're not diverse enough, and the actual action plan that prioritizes this. I think that's an incredibly powerful point. That what if that's all that we're required, that we prioritize this as an issue, that boards commit to prioritize this as an issue for the next couple of years. What would we see different? Would we see something really different?
I think we
rant.
would. Yeah. What was that?
That was my rant for the day.
Okay.
And I think there are two pieces there. Go ahead, Vernetta.
I think we would definitely see something different. And I think a question that boards need to ask is, what would it look like and what would it take for us to lead authentically? And let that sink in. Think about the work that you're doing. Think about your mission. Think about your values. Have a conversation. Is there a shared understanding of what we're trying to do? And again, to lead authentically, because there are too many people who don't have voices at the table in any shape, form, or fashion. And the questions, you raised the question about money. And I think in a lot of organizations, that's a default. I don't see it as an obstacle. It's a default, because there are folks who have money, but let's be clear, money and the ability to write a check, that's not governance. Organizations need funding, definitely, but considering how are you going to carry out governance, and again, what does that look like to do it in an authentic fashion? So I can separate the two, and I'm not saying that you don't want to cultivate relationships with individuals who also are passionate about your organization and are willing to write that check, but that's not your whole board. So there are a lot of different ways to go about this work. And let me turn to you, because you've been trying to jump in.
Well, no, that's actually a good segue, because I think it's both about, and this to me was what was so significant about defining of having a conversation about why diversity and inclusion are central to your organization's values, because it has to go beyond saying diversity is good. It has to go further into, why does diversity matter for our organization specifically? What does it mean to our organization, or what would it mean to our organization to truly be diverse, inclusive, and equitable, and be willing to have the tough conversation? How is it negatively impacting us as an organization, and in terms of the work that we do and the people that we serve if we don't? And sort of acknowledging the strategic blind spots that come from having a homogeneous group around the table. Maybe being willing to say that our board needs to be more of a strategic body than it is, rather than this vision of the, kind of big bucks board that raises a ton of money and is not adding a lot of other value, which is not the point. And then really translating that into action, because if you haven't made that case in a way that actually means something to your board members, it is lip service, and it's no wonder that it hasn't gone any further.
Ramona, I wonder if I could ask you, because there's a couple of questions in here that ask, what are the markers of a real commitment to that, that transformational change on a board? When do you know, when you're working with a board, that they are truly committed to making a change to greater diversity and inclusion?
Well, I think we touched on that a little bit earlier, is that the results is something different, that action has actually been taken, that it's no longer just a conversation about something that we want to do, something that we would like to do, something that we would like to see, but it actually ends in some clear results that you can see. I'm reminded of when I served on a board, and I was actually the chair of the board recruitment committee. And we would actually we would review the list of our current board members and those who were coming off, and we would look at new prospects, and we would look at everything about that person. So if fundraising was important, we would certainly look at that, but we would look at the race and ethnicity of the person. We would look at gender. So again, it takes that type of commitment and look at that between the full body of your board. And when at the end of the day, you really have diversity, then that means that what you said that you were about, those values that you stated that you believed in, you actually acted upon them. And again, we do have examples of where that does exist. I've talked to a couple of my colleagues, and they're like, well, some of our organizations like really get it, and some of them really do. But then there are others that, and we have to be honest and fair among ourselves, they don't. That is not something that they truly and honestly believe will make a difference.
And I want to add to that, because you asked about the markers of commitment, and I can tell you a couple of things that I've seen when an organization gets it. Okay, so they put in some work, they've had some really heartfelt conversations, and when that light bulb moment hits and they realize, it's not enough to say we want something. I've seen one board actually make room for it or space for it by having board members actually volunteer to step down, saying, is this important, And I'm willing, and I'm so committed. I believe in it enough that I will give up my seat. I've seen other boards that expand the number of members on their board, so within their range, to, again, be able to recruit not just one or two, but to really make space to start making the change and becoming the change that they want to see. So I think that speaks volumes. If it's a board member saying, you know what, I love this organization, I'm passionate about the mission, but also my passion for the mission means that I know that we can do better, and I'm willing to step down so that someone else can come in here and help us further our mission, advance our mission. That's commitment.
I would just add one other point as well, is that in terms of the markers, is that you throw excuses out the window. No more excuses in terms of, why we cannot, but look for ways that, yes, we can. And sometimes that means expanding your reach of where you look to find qualified and capable and valuable board members, and that can be in a number of different places and institutions, that can, right within your local communities, hospitals, schools, government at all levels, churches, right? So you have people everywhere who are possible board members. So let's forget about the excuses and let's try to find a way to make this happen.
I'm so glad you said that, Ramona, because one of the things that I was going to add is some of this is just acknowledging that board recruitment is not supposed to be easy, and that the better at it that you are, the more difficult or time intensive it may be. This is not about, scrambling 2 months before you need to elect a new board member and saying, who do we know that can fill this seat? It's really about being thoughtful over time about what perspectives, insights, networks, expertise you need around the table. And that means making it more challenging and taking your time. It also means saying no to candidates that might be great candidates, but don't help you meet the goals that you have at that moment in time, including diversity.
Right. I mean, I think that there are other cultural aspects to this, that boards have to be willing to grapple with. So, I'm going back to your comment earlier, and about the kind of comfort level that boards have, and how much they value that comfort level. Well, we really care about each other. We really understand each other. All things that you want to value on a board. And the kind of fear of what another will do to that comfort level is sometimes not something that you can name in a room. It's not something that people easily grapple with or admit to. And that when you say no excuses, you've got to kind of mean no excuses. Because when a system really doesn't want to change, it'll find anything to pin the lack of change on. In all of the kind of, but everybody's too extended. We can't find the right mix of people. I had a board tell me one time, oh yeah, we used to have a woman of color, but then her house burned down and she moved away. And I'm like, really? This is in New Haven? Really? But this is, I think that the reaching for excuses, instead of the looking for the ways to get it done, that's the shift that we have to make. So I think it's really interesting. I want to ask a question that has been asked so many times here. And we've gotten a huge number of questions. So, please forgive me, people, for not choosing yours necessarily. So the question is that a lot of people are saying that they find themselves in the middle of processes that are really just looking for tokens. And how do you determine whether there's a real drive for inclusion versus a drive just to look different?
So I'll jump in. Whether there's a real drive for, how do you determine? And I'd say you really have to look at or pay attention to the work that's being put in. We talked about this not being easy. It doesn't have to be tremendously hard, but there has to be, you have to lay a foundation. And I get asked a lot, like, how do we have these sensitive conversations or these tough conversations? And I always say, start with the mission. When they start making the connection to the mission, what will be gained, or what opportunities you might not have available because you're not putting in this work and trying to become more inclusive, then a number of things may come out. But if you don't have that conversation, if someone says, hey, we're applying for a grant, they want to know what's our board composition, our senior team composition, that's the wrong, that might be the impetus for a conversation, but that is not the conversation in and of itself. There are a number of ways to go about this, and I want to ask, how do you know it's a real commitment? Let me give one short story. I was recently talking to a chief executive, and he was talking about how they changed their board's composition. And for him, it didn't even start with a conversation around recognizing that the board had very little or no diversity. They started talking about their values. They started talking about the work that they're doing. And it just evolved into, who else do we need to be able to do this work? And one by one, they started bringing on board members who were people of color. How do you know that the commitment is real? I would say, look at what is the organization and what is the board willing to invest? And when I say invest, that can be a number of things. Training for the board, and I don't mean a one and done, like, okay, we have one training, now we're all ready. What measures are they setting for themselves to hold themselves accountable, to be transparent, to articulate the vision of what they see for their organization, what it would look like if they're more inclusive? That takes time to put in that level of work and ensure that there's a shared understanding of where they're trying to go as a board and an organization. Does the board need to allocate resources to help either whether it's collecting data, to actually do the work on the board itself, to have facilitated conversations if they're not capable of getting where they need to be, they don't have that expertise internally? Are they willing to put in extra time? I've seen board meeting agendas where they might allocate 15 minutes for a conversation. I'd say that's not a sign of a commitment. So there are a number of ways, and I think organizations can figure out the path forward that works best for them. But when you ask, is there commitment? I ask, how is that commitment demonstrated? How is it being demonstrated from the chief executive? How is it being demonstrated by the board chair or other members on the board? Because maybe the board chair isn't the champion, and that's okay, we'll work around it. But someone needs to step up and demonstrate commitment.
Right.
I would just add that, you know, nobody is one thing. And as a candidate, if you ever get the impression that the reason that you're being recruited to a board is because of one thing, whatever that thing might be, that's a flag. And as an organization, if you're recruiting board members, and I do think that this is possibly part of what's behind the responses around demographics. It's not demographics to the exclusion of all else. It's looking at demographics as a layer for board recruitment and your board recruitment strategy. And I think this is a place where, you know, the board matrix, the recruitment matrix gets misused all the time. You know, the idea that somehow it's a checklist and you're saying one of these, one of these, one of these, one of these, and that's not the point at all. It's really an opportunity to look at your overall board composition and in aggregate saying, do we have what we need in terms of skill sets, expertise, networks, perspectives? And if we don't, what are those gaps and how are we going to fill them? So I think that that's, you know, on that sort of tokenism or going through the motions around diversity, if you're feeling that one thing or if you are putting out that one thing, that's a problem.
You know, I think it's such a good point. We have a comment here by one of the people listening in that says that you know, generally that we don't want board members who haven't been in contact with our organization before, who haven't exhibited some interest in the issues that we're working on. And if the way we've been working in general has been exclusive of the voices of people of color, ethnic and racial minorities, that's a bigger problem. It doesn't just have to do with the board. And so if your pool really does not include any people coming up in leadership that are people of color, especially in an organization like, you know, like yours, Ramona, that those are, that's a real red flag, that's an issue of a larger organizational culture. It reminds me of the story that someone told me at one point where that they had realized, it was a women's shelter, they realized that there were no American Indian women coming to the shelter. And so they did a reach out to the local American Indian organization, who promptly told them that they were so culturally out to lunch in terms of what they were offering as an environment for the women that might come there from that community, that they, you know, they weren't going to even begin to consider trying to get women to come there until there was some learning done by the organization about their particular, about the way their culture was affecting another community. And I think that's at play a lot more than we think. So there may be some humbling that we have to do to ask, who are we to you? Who could we be to you? That maybe are the starting questions, rather than just, you know, looking for people to sit on our boards. Is this a larger organizational problem that we're looking at? Not to say that we don't want to require ourselves to diversify our boards, but it may in fact be something, a cultural lock that's larger than the board.
Yeah, and most likely it probably is when you start to look deeper. And to the other question that was asked about whether or not or how to determine if you might just be added as a token or to fulfill a diversity requirement. Again, if you begin to look more deeply into the organization itself, if there aren't any other sort of diversity type of initiatives that are taking place, if this is a one and done, then perhaps you are. But if the organization is making a much more broader commitment, again, to diversity and inclusion beyond just adding board members, then perhaps you're on to something.
I would say also, Ruth, you used the word humbling, that maybe they don't know everything. Part of this, I would say one requirement across the board is a willingness to learn. There are a lot of things that, and even now, today, I challenge myself to continue to learn. I know the vocabulary is changing, expectations are changing, and we have to have at least this openness and a curiosity to see what we can do differently. I want to go back and add on to something you were saying, Anne, about it can't be one thing and it never should be one thing. But that also raises the question, I've received this question a lot, is it okay for us to let a candidate or a prospect know that we're interested in becoming more diverse? And I say yes, that's the truth, but that can't be the end of the conversation. So I use myself as an example. If an organization approaches me and one of many things that they're telling me for the reason that they're interested, they may say, we've been doing a lot of thinking and talking about how we need to do things differently in the community, and we know that we need some different perspectives. So yes, we recognize, we acknowledge that we want to diversify. But here are all the things that we think you would be interested in, all the ways that we think that we can benefit each other, how we will value your opinion, et cetera. And it has to do with more than I am an African American, I'm a Black woman. So when you actually put in the work to understand the mission, where you're going, have those shared values, why it's important, then again, we're getting beyond tokenism. So this willingness to learn, to listen, to understand, and to act intentionally in terms of going about things differently. It all has to be there.
Can I ask, just before we end, because there have also been, this question has been asked any number of times, can you three just very quickly, just a quick round of the action that you recommend that people take first? You're talking now to those who are listening. Everybody's asking, what action? What action do I take? So
I would start with that conversation about why diversity and inclusion matters to your organization's mission and whether or not it's truly core to who you are as an organization and your organizational values. And the reason that I say that, because I know it keeps us in the talk space, but I think it's step one to the 1-2 punch of then actually being able to translate that into changed recruitment practices and being able to avoid the sort of blunt instrument of prioritizing demographics in recruitment without understanding why you're doing it.
So yes, I would definitely start with that foundation. And since you talked about that perfectly, and I would say moving beyond that, I'd say get unstuck. Know that if your recruitment practices have gotten you to where you are and that's no diversity, get unstuck by doing something very different. And that might mean talking to other community leaders and bringing them in to help you have a conversation, identify candidates, brainstorm. There are any number of ways. And if you don't have that intel within that inner circle within your board, which a lot of organizations, they don't, go external. So external, and don't be afraid to do that. So, but they would have to start by being clear with the conversation that Anne just talked about, and then be willing to reach out and have a number of conversations, and don't expect everything to come together overnight. You're going to have to do some cultivation and getting to know people and building relationships.
And I would say ditto to everything that has been said. Again, to all the organizations who want to change, who desire to change, I would say make that commitment today. Let the day today be the day that you change. It can be done, again, with the will and the might. And if you're looking for those board members who you feel that will add value to your board, expand the net, expand your reach. There are people everywhere. Look into those places that you typically don't to find those valuable board members. They're out there and they can bring a lot of value to your organization and to your mission, and you're probably overlooking them. So, do it today. Be the change that you want to see today.
Thank you very much, all of you. And I do want to say that I think that although people see this as somewhat of, a mountain to climb, the end point of it is so valuable and so rich and so different in terms of what you get from your board that it can be like night and day. I would just say, gird up and just say, we're going to get through it. And it may sometimes be tough, and it's going to sometimes be exhilarating, and we are going to ourselves have to change, because I think that's the nugget of it, is that we have to be willing to question who we are and to whom to make this happen. So it looks to me like we have a lot more talking to do, and so to be continued. But I do want to just close this by saying that we, BoardSource and NPQ are planning to do some studies of boards that have made these changes already, to just look at some of the steps they've taken and what the journey has been like. And so if any of you on this call would define yourselves that way, feel free to email one of us and let us know that you'd like to be considered as one of those case studies. And thank you so much, Ramona and Vernetta and Anne. This has been a wonderful first session, and I look forward to more of the same. Bye.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.